Imagine waking up the day after your entire world has just ended. And I don't mean a metaphorical end, like, a really bad breakup or losing your job. I mean a literal, catastrophic, completely world-shattering end.
Right. An actual apocalypse.
Exactly. You open your eyes, but the sky is completely blotted out. The air is so thick with the smell of wood smoke and pulverized stone that you can barely even draw a breath.
Oh, wow.
And you walk outside, and your city, the place you used to navigate blindfolded, the streets where you played as a child, the markets where you bought your food, it's just gone. It is burned to the ground.
Absolute devastation.
Yeah, and your leaders are either dead in the streets or they're being marched away in chains with like literal fish hooks through their lips.
Hmm.
And the most sacred monument you have, that towering gold-clad building you genuinely believed housed the actual literal presence of God, has just been violently reduced to a pile of smoking ash.
It's hard to even picture it.
Where do you even begin to find the words to process something like that? I mean, how do you look at that landscape and not just immediately lose your mind?
It is a staggering psychological precipice to stand on. I mean, most of us, thankfully, have never had to face a morning quite like that.
No, definitely not.
When you strip away all the infrastructure of your reality, your government, your economy, your religious center, the literal roof over your head, you are left with this terrifying absolute silence.
Right, because everything that told you who you were is just gone.
Exactly. And the immediate question for a survivor in that moment isn't how you rebuild a society. It is how you survive the psychological weight of that morning without fracturing into a million pieces.
And that terrifying silence is exactly what we are wading into today on this deep dive. We are looking at a masterclass in survival, really, through the lens of an incredible scholarly survey by Chris R. Velazquez.
A fascinating piece of work.
It really is. He focuses on a text that, if you're familiar with the Bible, you might know as a short, really heavy book tucked away in the Old Testament called the Book of Lamentations.
Yeah, it's easy to overlook if you aren't looking for it.
Right. But our mission today, the reason we're doing this deep dive, isn't just to do a dry historical recap. We are looking at how ancient people processed unimaginable trauma, the sheer literary genius they weaponized to survive it, and what their ancient raw grief teaches you about navigating loss today when the institutions around you just completely collapse.
Because to understand the scale of that shock, you really have to look at the immediate stakes. I mean, in the Hebrew Bible, this text is known simply as Ika.
Ika. And what does that mean?
Basically translates to how.
Just how? That's so stark.
Right. It's not really a title, it's a gasp. It's this cry of pure, unadulterated shock, and it emerges directly from the ash of the years 586 and 587 BCE.
So we are talking very specific history here.
Exactly. That is the exact historical moment when the Babylonian Empire completely obliterated Jerusalem and destroyed the first temple. Velazquez's survey describes this book as a poetic theodicy of ruin.
A poetic theodicy of ruin. Man, that is a dense phrase.
It's a bit academic, yeah.
I mean, I know a theodicy is basically an attempt to answer the problem of evil-like, if God is good and all-powerful, why do terrible things happen?
That's the core of it, absolutely. But a theodicy of ruin takes it a step further.
How so?
Well, this text is a way of looking at a totally shattered world and daring to ask God why, looking right at the destruction without, rushing to some cheap, happy ending.
Right. No silver linings.
Exactly. It's not sitting in a comfortable armchair debating philosophy. It is staring into the abyss of your destroyed life and fiercely insisting that the suffering has meaning, even if that meaning is agonizing.
Okay, but before we get to the poetry and the meaning, I really need to understand the ground they were standing on. I mean, how did they get to this morning of ash in the first place?
It's a complex political web, for sure.
Because the political collapse of the Kingdom of Judah seems remarkably rapid when you look at the timeline. It's not like they were slowly declining over like 500 years.
No, it was actually quite fast in the grand scheme of things.
Right. It all really kicks off with the death of King Josiah in 609 BCE, and then by 586 BCE, the nation is just erased. That's what, less than 25 years?
It is. The geopolitical landscape of the ancient Near East during that quarter century was shifting violently. You had these major tectonic plates of power colliding.
Okay, so who are the major players here?
Well, on one side, you have the ancient powerhouse of Egypt, and on the other, the rising, just unstoppable juggernaut of Babylon, led by Nebuchadnezzar II.
Right. Nebuchadnezzar, he's kind of a big deal in ancient history.
A massive deal. And Judah was this tiny, relatively insignificant kingdom situated right on the land bridge between them.
So they were basically the speed bump.
Yeah, exactly. They were completely caught in the crossfire of these massive imperial machinations.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because when you look at that timeline from 609 to 586, this wasn't just a sudden lightning strike out of a clear blue sky, right?
Not at all.
It's more like a small startup taking out desperate loans from two rival, heavily armed mob bosses.
That is a great way to put it.
Right. You try to play Egypt against Babylon, you default on your agreements, you ignore the warnings from the accountants, or in this case, the prophets, and eventually the bet comes due, and the bosses show up to violently liquidate your company.
The mob boss analogy is incredibly apt for ancient Near Eastern geopolitics. I mean, Babylon demanded tribute-heavy taxation and loyalty.
Basically, protection money.
Exactly. But Judah's leadership kept thinking they could rebel, relying on Egypt to come save them.
Yeah.
So they stopped paying tribute.
Which you never do with a mob boss.
Right. And so in 597 BCE, Babylon lost patience, marched in, and instituted the first deportations. They skimmed the cream of the crop.
Wait, so they didn't destroy it then, they just took people.
Yeah, they took King Jehoiachin, the craftsmen, the elites, the intellectuals, and dragged them off to Babylon. It was a massive warning shot.
Like breaking their kneecaps before taking the whole business.
Precisely. But the remaining puppet leadership in Judah still rebelled. So, in 586 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar didn't just come to collect tribute. He came to erase Jerusalem from the map.
You know, when we read ancient texts, it is so easy for modern readers to just brush off the descriptions. We think, oh, they're just exaggerating for dramatic effect.
Oh, for sure. People think ancient writers were just being poetic.
Right, like the city was laid waste probably just means the gates were broken and they lost a battle. How do we know this destruction wasn't just ancient exaggeration?
What's fascinating here is that the dirt literally tells the story. We don't have to guess or rely solely on ancient manuscripts.
Really? There's physical proof.
Oh, yeah. The archaeological evidence for this specific catastrophe is incredibly stark. When archaeologists dig in Jerusalem today, specifically in areas like the Javadi parking lot excavations, they find something called a destruction layer.
I love that term, a destruction layer. It sounds like a physical scar in the earth.
It really is a geological trauma. When you dig down to the stratum corresponding to the early 6th century BCE, the soil matrix completely changes.
What do you find in it?
You find ruined buildings that clearly collapsed inward. You find smashed storage jars and pottery in situ, meaning they are sitting exactly where they were left on that fateful day.
Like Pompeii or something.
Exactly like that. But most chillingly, you find massive, concentrated amounts of ash, charred wood, and burned material. The Babylonian devastation wasn't a metaphor.
So they literally burned the city to the ground.
They set a fire that burned so intensely for so long that it literally baked the mud and limestone of the city into powder. The material record perfectly matches the apocalyptic language we find in Lamentations.
Man, that takes it out of the realm of abstract theology and drops it right into hard historical fact.
Yeah.
You can reach out and touch the soot.
You really can.
But the source survey also mentions something called the Lachish ostraca. What are those?
So an ostracon is a piece of broken pottery that was used as a cheap writing surface. It's basically the scrap paper of the ancient world.
Because actual paper or papyrus was too expensive?
Right, papyrus was expensive. But if you broke a jug, you had 50 pieces of writing material. The Lachish ostraca are a collection of these broken sherds from the late 7th and early 6th century BCE, right around the time of the final collapse.
And what's written on them?
They contain desperate, frantic military correspondence from Judah's final days.
So we are literally reading the intercepted ancient text messages of a falling army.
That is exactly what they are. Lachish was a major, heavily fortified city southwest of Jerusalem, designed to protect the capital's flank.
Okay, so it was a key defensive position.
Yeah, and when you read these ostraca, which you can see today in places like the British Museum, you are reading the real-time communication breakdown of a kingdom.
Oh, wow.
You feel the military anxiety, the sheer terror as the Babylonian noose tightens. In one specific letter, a subordinate commander is writing to his superior, and he says something to the effect of, "We are watching for the fire signals of Lachish because we can no longer see the signals of Azekah."
Oh, wow. Azekah was another fortress, right? So the fire's going out means the fortress has fallen.
It's the ancient equivalent of a radar screen going dark, outpost by outpost. One blip vanishes, then another. And the commander is writing, terrified, realizing that the darkness is spreading toward him. until finally only Jerusalem is left surrounded.
That gives me goosebumps, just to be standing on a wall, peering into the night, waiting for a signal fire from your allies that never comes.
It's completely terrifying.
To know the empire is quite literally at your gates. And yet, out of that absolute annihilation, this text of Lamentations survived, which, considering the city burned to the ground, is a miracle in itself.
It really is.
The source mentions the Dead Sea Scrolls factor into this somehow.
They do, specifically fragments like 4Q111 found in the caves at Qumran.
Okay, and why is that significant?
Well, these date to the Second Temple period, centuries after the destruction. Finding Lamentations there proves that this book wasn't just a personal diary entry that got tossed in a drawer and forgotten.
Right, it was kept alive.
It was meticulously copied, preserved, and read by communities hundreds of years later. It became an established, sacred text because it held that much meaning for the survivors and their descendants.
And I think that's the core relevance for you listening to this deep dive right now. When you read Lamentations, you are not reading ivory tower philosophy written by a monk in a peaceful garden.
Not at all.
You are reading the literal words of trauma survivors. These are people living in the immediate smoking aftermath of a verified historical apocalypse.
Exactly.
They are dealing with mass starvation, the total collapse of their social order, and the shattering of their religious worldview.
Which forces us to ask a profound psychological question. How do you articulate a pain that seems entirely beyond the capacity of human language?
I mean, you can't, right? Not normally.
Right. When your reality is destroyed and you are surrounded by the bodies of your neighbors, you don't just scream into the void indefinitely. To survive it, you have to find a way to contain it. You have to build a structure for your grief.
And once you understand that they needed a structure to contain this unimaginable grief, you start to see the genius behind how the book was written.
It's brilliant.
Because Lamentations is not a history book outlining troop movements. It's not prose. It is poetry. And it uses an incredibly specific, hyper-rigid structure called an alphabetic acrostic.
Yes, the literary form of this book is inseparable from its meaning. It is composed of 5 poems, corresponding to its 5 chapters.
Okay, so 5 distinct poems.
Right, and chapters 1, 2, and 4 each have exactly 22 verses. Why 22? Because there are exactly 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet.
So it's literally A, B, C, D.
Yes. Verse 1 starts with the first letter, Aleph. Verse 2 starts with the second letter, Bet, and so on, moving sequentially all the way to the final letter, Tav.
And then chapter 3, sitting right in the middle of the book, intensifies this to an extreme degree.
It really does.
Because it has 66 verses, right? Since it is a triple acrostic, the first 3 verses all start with Aleph. The next 3 all start with Bet.
Exactly. It's so structured, it's almost claustrophobic.
Yeah. Now, when I first read that, I was genuinely baffled. I mean, you are sitting in the rubble of your burned out city. Your friends are gone. You are starving.
It doesn't seem like the time for poetry.
Right. Why on earth would you sit down and write alphabetical poetry? To me, it felt completely counterintuitive. If I'm grieving, I'm a mess, I'm not writing a sonnet.
It seems so artificial, doesn't it?
Yeah. But then I really thought about human behavior in a crisis, and I realized it's a bit like when you go through a devastating, life-altering breakup, and instead of crying in bed, suddenly it's 3 a.m. and you are on your hands and knees meticulously scrubbing the grout in your bathroom with a toothbrush.
That is a phenomenal psychological insight. It really is the exact same impulse.
Because you just need something you can fix.
Exactly. When the external world has descended into absolute uncontrollable chaos, the human mind desperately craves order. It needs something it can control.
So the alphabet is their toothbrush and grout.
That's it. The acrostic form imposes a rigid, unbreakable linguistic order on an experience that feels entirely disordered and senseless. It serves as a container strong enough, rigid enough to hold the explosive, radioactive emotions of the trauma so they don't destroy the speaker entirely.
It also provides this sense of totality, like you are grieving from A to Z, or, in Hebrew, from Aleph to Tav.
Yes, a complete exhaustive expression.
You are telling the universe, I am going to exhaust the entire alphabet to describe this pain. I am leaving no letter, no angle, no emotion unexplored.
And the scholarly survey notes that this acrostic function serves multiple purposes simultaneously. Practically, it's mnemonic. It helps the community memorize the poem for oral transmission, which was crucial in the ancient world.
Right, because they didn't all have copies of the scroll.
Exactly. Aesthetically, it shows immense poetic skill. But theologically, it represents completeness. It forces the writer and the reader to walk painstakingly, step by step, letter by letter, through the horror.
You can't just skip the hard parts.
Yeah. No, you cannot skip ahead. You cannot rush past the pain to get to a happy ending. You must walk the entire path of the alphabet.
But structure is only half the genius here. The other half is how they use personification. They don't just talk about Jerusalem as like a coordinate on a map or a list of destroyed buildings.
No, they make it incredibly intimate.
Yeah, they personify the city as a character named Daughter Zion.
In the ancient Near Eastern world, capital cities were frequently personified as women, specifically as daughters or wives of the patron deity.
Okay, so that was a common trope back then.
Yes. By personifying Jerusalem, the poet takes a massive, incomprehensible geopolitical event, the fall of a nation-state, and distills it into a deeply personal, intimate image. Daughter Zion is depicted as a weeping widow, stripped of her royal glory.
And betrayed by her allies, right?
Exactly. Betrayed by her political lovers, nations like Egypt who promised aid and never showed up, and now she's sold into forced labor. It forces the reader to empathize with a living, suffering entity rather than a pile of rocks.
And the poetry itself has a specific audible rhythm to it, doesn't it? Even if you don't know Hebrew, the sound of the text matters.
Deeply. The predominant rhythm used here is called the kina meter.
Kima, okay.
In ancient Hebrew poetry, rhythm isn't about rhyming sounds at the end of a sentence like in English. It's about the cadence of the syllables and the stress beats in a line.
So it's more about the beat.
Right. A normal, balanced poetic line might be, say, 3 stresses followed by 3 stresses. It feels stable. But the kina, which is the classic Hebrew lament or funeral dirge rhythm, is fundamentally unbalanced.
Unbalanced how?
It is typically a 3-2 rhythm, 3 beats, a pause, and then a shorter falling 2 beats.
3 beats, pause, 2 beats. It feels like something is missing. Like you were expecting the third beat on the back half and it just drops out.
Exactly. It creates a limping, mournful cadence. It's a rhythmic falling away. If you read it aloud in Hebrew, it literally mimics the sound of a sob.
Wow, so the sound itself is crying.
Yes. Or the heavy, dragging step of someone carrying an unbearable weight. They take 2 steps and they stumble. The content describes a broken society, and the very meter of the poem is audibly, mathematically broken. The form matches the function perfectly.
Once you understand that they built this rigid, alphabetical, limping cage to trap their grief, you really start to see how that grief mutates as you read through it.
It definitely evolves from chapter to chapter.
Let's walk through the chapters, because the emotional landscape changes dramatically from the first letter to the last. Let's look at the first 2 poems, chapters 1 and 2.
Right, where the primary themes are the isolation of the widow and the terror of the wrath.
Chapter 1 is incredibly visceral. The source highlights this haunting imagery of loneliness. How lonely sits the city that was full of people.
It's such a stark image.
It really is.
Yeah.
The roads to Zion are literally mourning because no one is walking on them to come to the festivals anymore. The gold has lost its shine. But it's not just physical emptiness, is it? Zion is deeply disgraced.
And here we have to understand the concept of honor-shame dynamics, which were the absolute operating system of the ancient Mediterranean world.
Right, it wasn't just about losing, it was about the humiliation.
Zion isn't just defeated militarily. She is publicly humiliated. The text describes her as being laid bare, exposed, and mocked by her enemies who are laughing at her downfall.
Which is brutal in that culture.
In a culture driven by honor, that kind of public, visceral shame is a fate worse than death. It's a complete stripping of dignity. But as dark as chapter 1 is, chapter 2 introduces a theological shock that is genuinely hard for many modern readers to stomach.
It really is. Chapter 2 gets difficult because God is explicitly named as the enemy. The text says the Lord has become like an enemy, swallowing up Israel, breaking down the strongholds in his fierce anger.
Yeah, they don't hold back at all.
It's not just Babylon firing the arrows. God is the one pulling down the defensive walls.
The author absolutely refuses to let the Babylonians take the ultimate credit. The Babylonians are merely the instruments, the hammer in the hand.
The tool, basically.
Right. The real existential terror of chapter 2 is the realization that God himself is the architect of the ruin. The text does not shy away from divine wrath. It is uncompromising.
There is absolutely no cheap optimism here.
None. The poetry stares directly at the sin of the people and the terrifying, violent reality of divine judgment.
It's bracing. It refuses to let you say, well, bad things just happen, the universe is random. It insists that this catastrophe has moral gravity.
It demands that you look at the cause.
Exactly. But then, right when the darkness feels completely suffocating, we hit chapter 3. And here's where it gets really interesting because chapter 3 is the pivot point of the entire book.
Structurally and theologically, chapter 3 is the epicenter. Remember, this is the chapter with the massive 66-verse triple acrostic.
The one that's super claustrophobic.
Exactly. It is the most intensely structured part of the entire composition. And right out of the gate, the perspective shifts abruptly.
It zooms in, right?
We move away from the grand, personified city of Daughter Zion, and suddenly we are trapped inside the mind of a singular, specific individual. He says, I am the man who has seen affliction under the rod of his wrath.
It feels incredibly tight and suffocating at the start of chapter 3. The speaker says God has walled him in, weighed him down with heavy chains, made his teeth grind on gravel.
Grinding teeth on gravel, I mean, you can feel that.
It is a portrait of total despair, but right in the middle of this intense personal suffering, literally at the mathematical center of the entire book, the tone completely flips. Verses 22 through 33.
The great turning point.
I read this and it almost gave me whiplash. In the middle of all this death, the author suddenly claims to have hope. That makes no sense. What are they possibly hoping in? The city is still gone.
It is arguably one of the most remarkable transitions in all of ancient literature. The speaker is listing all these horrors, the gravel in his teeth, the chains, and then suddenly pauses and says, but this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope.
Just out of nowhere.
And what follows is a cluster of crucial Hebrew vocabulary that changes the entire trajectory of the text. It doesn't make logical sense until you understand the specific legal and emotional terms being deployed.
The survey points out two massive words here, hesed and rahamim. Let's dig into those.
Yes. Let's start with hesed. It is notoriously difficult to translate into English, often rendered as steadfast love or covenant loyalty.
Okay, so it's not like romantic love.
Not at all. You
Okay.
have to strip away any modern romanticized notions of love. Hesed is not a fleeting, warm, emotional feeling of affection. It is a fierce, stubborn, legally binding commitment to a relationship.
Like a treaty.
Exactly. It is the kind of loyalty a king promises to a subject or a husband to a wife in an ancient covenant. It's a love that is bound by an oath, refusing to let go, no matter how terribly the other party has failed.
Man, it's a love with a spine of steel.
That's a perfect way to describe it. And the second word is rahamim, which translates to compassions or mercies.
Okay, and what's the deeper meaning there?
What is fascinating about rahamim is its etymology. It derives from the Hebrew root word rehem, which literally means womb.
Wow, so it denotes a deep, visceral, almost maternal tenderness.
It is the feeling a mother has for the child she carried. So, sitting in the absolute ashes of a destroyed city, this solitary man connects these two ideas.
The steel spine and the maternal tenderness.
Yes. He says, the steadfast, oath-bound love, the hesed of the Lord never ceases. His womb-like mercies, his rahamim, never come to an end. They are new every morning.
That is staggering. The contrast between the baked ash of the parking lot and mercies new every morning is almost too much to process.
And the source makes a vital point here. Hope in Lamentations 3 is not based on circumstances improving.
Because nothing is improved.
Exactly. The speaker isn't saying, I have hope because the Babylonians are retreating. They aren't. I have hope because the harvest is coming. It isn't. The hope is based entirely, 100%, on God's internal character.
So it's an internal confidence, not an external one?
The speaker argues that because God is fundamentally a God of hesed, he will not cast off forever.
The Hebrew word for hope used here is tikva. The source calls it a fragile but real hope. I love that description.
It's very poetic.
It's like a single tiny green shoot pushing its way up through the pavement of a bombed-out street. It's weak, it's vulnerable, but it's alive.
Tifa is an expectation, a posture of waiting. The sufferer is fully submitting to the reality of the judgment. He accepts that the nation deserved it, but he is quietly, stubbornly insisting that God's wrath is not his final word. His mercy is his final word.
But the genius of Lamentations is that it doesn't just end there. It doesn't roll the credits on that high note of triumph.
That would be too easy.
Right. It forces us to walk back out into the ruin in chapters 4 and 5. And chapter 4 is arguably the darkest poem in the entire book. It flashes back to the horrific realities of the siege itself.
Chapter 4 is deeply unsettling because it uses terrifying before and after contrasts to illustrate the totality of the social collapse.
Right. The contrast is what makes it so sharp.
It looks at the former elites, the princes who used to wear expensive purple, dyes, and had bodies glowing with health, like polished sapphire. And now, during the famine of the siege, they are completely unrecognizable, covered in soot, digging through the garbage heaps for scraps of food.
It strips away all the illusions of human power and wealth. It highlights the absolute failure of their political alliances, too. They kept straining their eyes, looking for Egypt to come save them, and nobody came.
Just waiting for the rescue that never arrives.
And the text goes to the darkest possible places of human desperation during a famine. It explicitly mentions starving infants whose tongues stick to the roof of their mouths. It mentions mothers who are driven by sheer starvation to do unimaginable, horrific things just to survive.
It really is a brutal read.
It's a necessary reminder that when institutions fail and social orders collapse, the physical reality is absolute hell.
Which brings us to the final poem, chapter 5. And structurally, something fascinating happens here that shifts the entire dynamic of the book.
Right, the structure changes again.
Up until now, we've been firmly in the grip of the acrostic. Chapter 5 is exactly 22 verses long, just like chapters 1, 2, and 4. You would expect it to follow the alphabet, but it doesn't.
Wait, it just drops the alphabet entirely?
It abandons the acrostic structure entirely.
When I realized that, it hit me like a punch to the gut. I mean, they have maintained this incredibly rigid, exhausting discipline of the alphabet for 4 chapters, trying to build a cage to contain the chaos.
Exactly.
And right at the end, the cage breaks. The container shatters, the grief is simply too massive, and the formal structure dissolves into a direct, breathless, desperate plea.
It is a brilliant literary device. The order has broken down again. The chapter shifts from an individual speaker to a communal voice.
So it's not just I anymore, it's we.
Yes, the entire surviving community comes together and cries out, "Remember, O Lord, what has befallen us. Look and see our disgrace."
And it ends on a cliffhanger. It doesn't wrap up with a neat bow. The
Yeah.
second to last verse uses the Hebrew word shav, which means to restore or return.
Right, it's a plea for restoration.
It says, "Restore us to yourself, O Lord, that we may be restored." That sounds hopeful. But the very last verse of the book pulls the rug out from under you.
It does. The final verse essentially says, "Restore us, unless you have utterly rejected us and remain exceedingly angry with us."
To end a sacred text on the word unless, it leaves the door cracked open to the terrifying possibility that maybe God won't bring them back. It demands that you sit in the tension of unresolved trauma.
It is a plea grounded in God's enduring reign, but the human earthly experience of it is entirely painfully unresolved.
All of this visceral poetry and shattered structure begs a massive question. The search for why? We've seen the history, we've walked through the emotional landscape, but what is the meaning behind this disaster? How did the authors themselves understand why this happened to them?
To understand their internal logic, you have to understand the Deuteronomic theology that underpins the entire worldview of ancient Israel.
Okay, Deuteronomic theology.
Yes, this requires looking back at older texts,
Mhm.
specifically Leviticus chapter 26 and Deuteronomy chapter 28.
The covenant theology.
Yes. You have to realize that the relationship between Yahweh, the God of Israel, and the people of Judah was not a casual religious affiliation. It wasn't just, we like this God. It was a formal, legally binding treaty.
Like an actual contract.
Exactly. In the ancient Near East, there was a political structure known as a suzerain vassal treaty.
A suzerain vassal treaty, how did that work?
A massive emperor, the suzerain would make a treaty with a lesser king, the vassal. The treaty laid out strict terms. If the vassal was loyal, paid their tribute, and obeyed the laws, the emperor provided military protection, blessing, and prosperity.
But if they rebelled?
If they breached the treaty, they invoked the covenant curses. The emperor would bring the hammer down. Israel viewed their relationship with God through this exact legal framework.
So God was the suzerain and Israel was the vassal.
God was the sovereign suzerain.
Right.
Israel was the vassal state. The terms of the covenant were the Torah. If they worshipped other gods, or if they perpetrated systemic social injustice, oppressing the poor, ignoring the widow, they broke the treaty.
And the consequences were mapped out in advance.
And Deuteronomy 28 is incredibly, terrifyingly explicit about what the covenant curses look like.
Yeah.
It lists failed harvests, disease, military defeat, siege, starvation, and ultimately being ripped out of the land into exile.
So the authors of Lamentations are standing in the ash, looking at the destruction of 586 BCE, and they aren't saying, oh, the Babylonian gods must be stronger than our God.
No, not at all.
They are saying this is happening precisely because our God is keeping his word. We broke the treaty, we ignored the warnings, and the curses we agreed to have fallen upon us.
Exactly. It is a horrific realization, but oddly, it preserves their theology. God isn't weak. God is fiercely just.
Okay, I have to push back on that, though, because as a modern reader, I hear that, and my immediate thought goes straight to justice and fairness. If God is just, why do the innocent suffer alongside the guilty?
It's the classic question, yeah.
We literally just talked about starving infants in chapter 4. What treaty did a 1-year-old break? How does this theological framework handle the immense collateral damage of divine judgment?
What's fascinating here is that if we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to recognize a massive cultural and psychological gap between us and the ancient authors.
How so?
You and I live in a modern Western framework that is characterized by deep, entrenched individualism. We believe that a person is an autonomous island, and they should only be punished for their own specific personal crimes.
Right. You do the crime, you do the time.
But ancient Judah and most of the ancient world operated on a concept of corporate identity.
Corporate identity, meaning the group, the collective, is the primary unit of existence, not the individual.
Precisely. In their worldview, the fate of the city, the temple, the king, the priests, and the common people were completely, inextricably intertwined. They lived, breathed, and died as a single organic body.
So it's more like an ecosystem.
Exactly. Think about it like a major corporation today. Imagine the CEO and the board of directors engage in massive, decades-long financial fraud. Eventually, the federal government finds out, and they shut the company down. The CEO might go to jail, but what happens to the 10,000 entry-level employees working in the warehouses?
They lose their jobs, they lose their pensions, they lose their health care. The destruction falls on the whole corporate body, even though the warehouse worker didn't cook the books.
Exactly. When the leadership class of Judah, the kings, the priests, the prophets, became morally and spiritually corrupt, the entire system became diseased.
And the text points this out, right?
Lamentations is acutely aware of this. It points out the failure of the leaders explicitly. It says the prophets saw false visions and the priests shed the blood of the righteous in the streets.
So the innocent suffering isn't because they're individually guilty?
The theological lesson here isn't that every starving infant was secretly a terrible sinner. The lesson is that systemic corporate sin has systemic catastrophic consequences. When institutions rot from the head down, the vulnerable, the widows, the orphans, the poor, always end up bearing the heaviest, most brutal weight of the suffering.
That makes a lot of sense.
Lamentations serves as a stark, timeless warning about the sheer collateral damage of institutional failure.
That feels uncomfortably relevant to literally any era of human history. The vulnerable always pay the tab for the powerful. Before we move on to how this text has survived to the modern day, I want to touch briefly on who actually wrote this incredible, haunting poetry.
The authorship debate is always interesting.
Because if you open a Christian Bible, Lamentations is tucked right after the book of Jeremiah, and tradition has always said Jeremiah wrote it. He was literally known as the weeping prophet.
Traditional Christian and rabbinic tradition has indeed long attributed the book to Jeremiah. And it makes intuitive sense. He was a prominent prophet, present for the fall of Jerusalem. He warned about the disaster for decades. And his own prophetic book details the immense trauma of the siege and the aftermath.
But the survey points out that the text of Lamentations itself is completely anonymous. It never claims to be written by Jeremiah.
It doesn't. And modern scholarship largely leans away from strict Jeremianic authorship. The consensus is that Lamentations is a carefully shaped collection of poems written by anonymous trauma survivors, likely compiled in the immediate raw aftermath of 586 BCE.
So it's probably not just one guy.
Probably not. Now, it is undeniably deeply influenced by Jeremianic thought and vocabulary, which makes perfect sense because Jeremiah's theology was the dominant lens through which the survivors tried to understand their horrific fate.
Right, but leaving the author anonymous actually serves an incredibly powerful literary purpose.
How do you mean?
Well, it strips away the ego. If it has a specific name attached, it becomes Jeremiah's personal diary. But by remaining anonymous, it becomes universal. It becomes the collective voice of the entire shattered community. Anybody can step into that "I am the man who has seen" affliction space.
Precisely. It allows the text to transcend its original author and become a vessel for the grief of subsequent generations.
Which moves us beautifully into how this ancient survival manual for grief became a cornerstone of both Jewish and Christian traditions, and what it means for you, the listener, navigating the modern world today.
In the Jewish tradition, Lamentations is foundational. Interestingly, in the Hebrew Bible, it's not placed with the prophetic books like Jeremiah. It's located in the Ketuvim, the writings. Specifically, it is one of the 5 Megillot, or scrolls.
And it isn't just studied academically, right? It has a very specific visceral liturgical use.
It does. It is read publicly every single year on Tisha B'Av, the ninth day of the Hebrew month of Av.
What happens on that day?
This is the solemn communal day of fasting and mourning that commemorates the destruction of the first temple by the Babylonians and historically the destruction of the second temple by the Romans centuries later.
Oh, wow. So it covers both tragedies.
Yes. For the Jewish community, Lamentations provides the enduring, necessary vocabulary for collective memory. It ensures that the trauma of the past is never minimized, sanitized, or forgotten.
And in the Christian tradition, it functions slightly differently. As we mentioned, it's placed right after Jeremiah, which positions it as a sort of hinge book in redemptive history.
In Christian theology, Lamentations sits right in the agonizing tension between the realized historical judgment of the Old Testament and the awaited future restoration. It points forward.
Even though it's so focused on the past destruction.
Right. While there is no direct, explicit messianic prophecy in the book, Christian Christology sees profound theological echoes.
I instantly think of the moment in the New Testament where Jesus is looking down at Jerusalem and weeping.
It's a powerful connection. When Jesus looks at Jerusalem in the Gospel of Luke and weeps over it, prophesying its future destruction because they did not recognize the time of their visitation, he is consciously embodying the grief of Lamentations. He is the weeping prophet looking at the doomed city.
So he's kind of stepping into that historical role.
Furthermore, Christian theology views Jesus on the cross as the ultimate final fulfillment of the righteous sufferer we see in chapter 3 of Lamentations.
The man who has seen affliction under the rod of his wrath.
Right. In the Christian view, Jesus bears the divine judgment and the covenant curses that Lamentations so vividly describes in order to secure the hesed, that steadfast, oath-bound love and mercy that the book desperately hopes for.
So it's like resolving the tension of the book.
The cross is seen as the cosmic intersection where the fierce wrath detailed in chapter 2 and the inexhaustible mercy detailed in chapter 3 finally meet and are resolved.
So what does this all mean? We've covered Babylonian siege tactics, alphabetical poetry, ancient suzerain vassal treaties, corporate identity, and centuries of theology. But what does a 2.5 millennia-old book of ancient grief mean for you today?
The primary overriding takeaway that the source emphasizes is this: Lamentations proves, once and for all, that grief is not faithlessness.
That is so important to hear.
So often in our modern world, whether in religious circles or in the secular self-help industry, there is this immense toxic pressure to just get over it.
To find the silver lining, right. To project unyielding positivity.
Yes, we are told that if you are deeply sad or angry or broken, you somehow lack faith or you lack resilience. Lamentations completely obliterates that idea.
It really redefines lament. It says that complaining to God, pouring out your grief, is actually a disciplined, truthful form of faith.
To complain to God, to lay out your anger, your confusion, and your sorrow in meticulous alphabetical detail implies a profound belief.
Because you're still talking to him.
Exactly. It implies that you believe God is actually there to hear it, that he cares enough to listen, and that he is capable of doing something about it. Apathy and silence are the opposite of faith. True lament is deeply faithful because it demands that God show up in the ruin. It refuses to let God off the hook.
I think that is incredibly liberating. Whether you are dealing with a profound personal trauma, the sudden loss of a loved one, a terrifying medical diagnosis, a divorce, or whether you are reeling from a massive institutional failure, like a scandal in your church, political collapse, or the betrayal of a community you trusted.
You don't have to pretend everything is fine.
Exactly. You don't have to force a premature, happy closure. You don't have to tie a neat little bow on your suffering. Truthful speech before God, even if it is angry, unresolved, messy speech, is completely validated by this text.
The book teaches us that robust faith does not require emotional numbness. It requires absolute honesty.
And it gives us permission to sit in the ashes.
It gives us permission to sit in the ashes of our shattered expectations and say out loud, this hurts, this is wrong, and I don't understand why this is happening. And yet beneath that profound honesty, to stubbornly, defiantly hold on to the tikka.
That fragile green shoot of hope.
Yes, insisting that mercy might just be new every morning.
We have covered so much ground today. To summarize our journey, we started in the literal baked ashes of the Javadi parking lot, verifying the historical reality and the sheer terror of Jerusalem's destruction in 586 BCE.
We really went deep into the dirt on that one.
We explored the brilliant, desperate literary architecture of grief, how survivors used rigid alphabetical cages and the limping, sobbing kind of meter to impose order on a world that had lost its mind.
The structure of survival.
We walk through the raw, uncompromising theology of a God who brings judgment, but who holds an inexhaustible reserve of hesed, steadfast covenant love at the very center of the chaos. And we saw how the book refuses to wrap up neatly, ending on a breathless cliffhanger that challenges us to hold both judgment and hope in tension, recognizing the devastating cost of corporate sin while trusting in the ultimate mercy of the divine.
But before we sign off, the survey contains one final, incredibly provocative thought that expands this conversation far beyond the borders of ancient Judah.
Oh, right, the Mesopotamian connection.
In the archaeological background section, it mentions that Lamentations doesn't exist in a total cultural vacuum. Long before the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem, the Sumerians and other ancient Mesopotamian cultures wrote sweeping, elaborate poetic laments over the destruction of their own cities and temples.
Wait, really? So there are other ancient laments out there?
Oh yeah, there's an entire ancient genre of city laments. Nippur, Uruk all had poems mourning their fall.
Which means that mourning the fall of a city, the loss of brick, mortar, and public squares, is not just a Jewish or Christian phenomenon. It is an incredibly ancient, deeply shared human instinct.
It is a universal human response to civilizational collapse. And it prompts a profound psychological question for us today.
What's that?
What is it about a city, the collective space where we bump shoulders with strangers, where we trade, where we govern, and where we worship, that makes its destruction feel like the death of a living, breathing person?
Why do we intuitively personify our physical home?
Exactly. When the physical spaces that hold our communities together are shattered, how does that fundamentally shatter our internal psychological worlds? Are we, in the end, inextricably bound to the physical places we build?
That is a haunting question, and we want to encourage you to sit with that unresolved thought, just as Lamentations forces us to sit with unresolved hope. Think about the physical spaces that hold your life together and what it means to be inextricably bound to your community. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Take care of yourselves, and we'll see you next time.